Counselor Nirave had spoken before the full conquered more times than she could count, and never once had her hands felt cold on the podium. They felt cold now. The great chamber of Halcyon Station rose around her in slow rings of pale metal and glass turning above the blue star Sela the way it always had, patient and bright and indifferent to what was said beneath it. Every seat was filled. Delegates with scaled faces, delegates with too many eyes, delegates who were only shifting light behind glass. All of them waiting. All of them watching the small human standing at the center of the floor. She read the measure aloud in her own steady voice, and she believed every word of it. Earth would surrender 3/4 of its war fleet. Every heavy vessel dismantled under Concord supervision. Every weapons program folded down to defense alone. Somewhere to her left, old Emiru of the Olan rose halfway from his seat. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the way it always was. "Do not do this now," he said. "Not this year. Something is moving at the border, and you are about to take teeth out of the one mouth still willing to bite for us." Nirave did not turn to look at him. She had heard the rumors too. She had chosen not to let them change her mind. "The accord stands," she said, and the chamber moved on, and she told herself the cold in her hands meant nothing at all. The human ambassador was named Nathan Rourke, and he did not argue the way she expected a proud species to argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He stood with his hands flat on the podium's edge and his back very straight, and he waited until the murmuring settled before he spoke, as if he had all the time in the world. "Humanity built those ships," he said, "because humanity remembers what it was to be weak." He let that sit. Nirave had studied his kind for years, and she still found the stillness of them unsettling. Older species filled silence. They flared their crests. They clicked their mandibles. They let you know where their fear lived. This one just stood there calm as cold water, and made the whole chamber lean toward him to hear. "We fought 2 wars against ourselves in the last century," Rourke went on. "Not against the stars. Against each other. We nearly finished the job. So when this Concord found us and told us we were welcome among you, we did not hear a promise of safety. We heard how far we still had to fall if we ever stopped watching the dark. No other member has grown a fleet this fast," Nirave answered. "Species far older than yours. Species who have fought real enemies do not build the way you build. The Concord must ask what humanity is preparing for. Humanity has never once acted against a member world." Rourke's eyes came to rest on her, and they did not blink. "We have honored every treaty. We have sent aid to 4 colonies struck by disaster in the last 3 years. We are not the danger in this room, counselor, but I understand that belief is not proof, and I understand that fear does not listen to reason. So I will not waste the Concord's time asking it to be reasonable." That should have pleased her. It did not. The vote was set for 3 days out. Rourke inclined his head to the chamber, unhurried, and stepped down from the floor. At the last moment he paused, and for the first time something firmer moved under the calm. "Humanity did not come to the stars with empty hands," he said. "We came because we wanted to be part of something larger than one small world. We did not come to be told we may not defend our own home." He looked once around the rings of watching faces. "Remember that, whatever you decide." Then he was gone, and the chamber filled again with the low tide of 100 translated voices, and Nirave sat down in her seat and pressed her cold hands flat against her knees, and could not have said if anyone had asked why the room suddenly felt so much emptier than it had a moment before. She had built her whole life on a single conviction, and it was a good one. She had watched the records of a dozen worlds that grew strong too fast and turned that strength on their neighbors or on themselves until there was nothing left to rule. Power without a leash broke everything it touched. That was not fear. That was history. The charter was not cruelty. It was the only wall she knew how to build against a fire she had watched consume species older and wiser than these young, violent, frightening humans. She told herself all of it sitting there, and she believed it. She just wished her hands would warm. 3 days later, the vote passed the way she had known it would, by a wide and comfortable margin carried by 100 delegations that had spent 8 years watching human shipyards burn brighter every season and had grown quietly afraid of the light. Humanity had few friends on that floor. Its own history did the arguing for its enemies. A species that had nearly ended itself did not get the benefit of the doubt, and so the doubt fell the other way, and the charter became law. Far from that bright chamber at the bottom of a building, sunk deep beneath the old city of Geneva, a woman read the terms of it 3 times before she set the tablet face down on the table. Fleet Admiral Mirasalis was 48 years old, with black hair going gray at the temples and the kind of quiet in her face that a person only earned by giving a great many hard orders and living with all of them. She had built the human fleet. She had signed the keels of ships meant to keep a young world safe in a galaxy it barely understood. Now a room full of strangers 1,000 light years away had told her to take it all apart, and she was expected to thank them for the privilege of doing it. Across from her, General Adrian Kane sat with his jaw tight. He was younger, broader, the temper he usually kept behind a level voice sitting a little closer to the surface today. 3/4, he said. Not reduced, Mira. Gutted. They want us defenseless. I read the number. Solace stood and walked to the wall to the screen that pretended to be a window this far underground, showing the night sky above the city in a slow, false crawl of cloud. The Concord is afraid of us. It always has been. We spent 100 years killing each other before we ever left this rock, and they looked at that and decided we could not be trusted with a knife. And when something out past the border decides Earth looks like an easy meal, Kane leaned forward. You've read the same reports I have. A convoy gone dark near the frontier. Whispers about something called the Scarn, pushing into space. Nobody's mapped. The galaxy isn't safe just because 100 delegates voted that it should be. Solace turned back from the false window. She had been turning this exact moment over in her mind for longer than Kane knew, since almost the day Earth first sat down at that great ring of a table. A project so quiet that fewer than 24 people alive were aware it existed. A single answer folded away in the dark in case the day ever came when the whole galaxy had just been told out loud that humanity could not defend itself. Adrian. She said, it's time to bring Anvil Station to full activation. Kane went very still. If the Concord ever learns Anvil exists, they'll take apart every ship we've ever admitted to owning. Then we make sure they don't learn. Solace sat back down and folded her hands on the table. We built her past the last cold edge of the system for exactly this. Everyone out there just heard that Earth is going to become harmless. Every hungry thing in the dark heard it too. Her eyes were steady. I would rather have an answer ready and never need it than need it and not have one. Kane studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and certain, the way a man does when he has stopped hoping he was wrong. I'll send the order tonight, he said, quietly. And far beyond the orbit of the last cold planet, past the thin scatter of ice and rock that marked the end of everything, the human race called home. A shape drifted in the deep dark that gave off no light, no signal, no warmth. A sensor could find. Inside it, something enormous slept in the black and waited, and had no idea yet how soon it would be asked to wake. The chamber emptied slowly after the vote, the way a tide goes out, and Nirave stayed in her seat long after the last delegation had drifted for the doors. She had won. She kept reminding herself of that. The charter was law now, ratified by 100 worlds, and in 2 years the human fleet would be a memory and a scrapyard, and the peace she had spent her life defending would be a little safer than it had been that morning. She did not feel safe. She felt like someone who had bolted every door in the house, and only now begun to wonder whether the danger was already inside. Humanity had gone quietly. That was the part that would not leave her alone. She had expected fury threats, at the very least a grand and wounded speech she could dismiss. Instead, the ambassador had bowed his head and walked out calm as still water, and told her to remember. Older species raged when you cornered them. They wanted you to see their teeth. This one had simply agreed and left and taken something out of the room with him that she could not name. She rose at last and went to her private quarters, and there the reports were waiting for her, as they always were. A trading convoy near the frontier had gone dark 3 weeks past. A scout sent to find it had found only wreckage, and on the broken hull plates, a pattern of burn that matched no weapon in the entire archive of the Concord. There were whispers now moving through the diplomatic corps, careful whispers about a species that lived past the edge of every chart. Something old, something that had never until very recently bothered to look toward settled space at all. She read it twice and set it down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The peace had kept for centuries on one simple rule: no single member may grow strong enough to frighten the rest. That rule had held 100 worlds together through 800 years of history, and she had defended it today with her whole heart, and she believed in it still. But she had just taken the teeth out of the one member, willing to bite. And somewhere out past the last map star, something with teeth of its own had begun to test the fences. She told herself again that she had made the right choice. She was still telling herself that when she finally slept. On Earth, the news reached ordinary people within the hour, and it landed differently in every house it entered. Some were furious, calling it an insult, a slap after everything humanity had done to prove it belonged. Some were relieved, hoping fewer guns meant fewer enemies. Most were simply confused, waiting to see what any of it would mean for the price of bread and the shape of their ordinary days. In a small apartment above a noisy street in Chicago, a young naval officer named Jonah Adeyemi watched the broadcast in silence, a cooling cup of coffee, forgotten in his hands. 3/4, his roommate said. That's not a cut. That's everything. Jonah did not answer right away. He had joined the fleet 3 years ago, proud to serve aboard one of the very carriers that would now be broken down into scrap under alien eyes. He was thinking instead about his uncle Eli, who was not really his uncle, but had raised him more than anyone with the right to the word ever had. Eli Marchetti had taught him to solder a joint and to hold his temper and to finish a thing once he'd started it. And Eli was out at a mining station on the far frontier right now, elbow deep in a water reclamation system doing patient, unglamorous work of making a dead rock somewhere, fit for people to live on. Jonah had told him not to take the frontier contract. Too far out, he'd said. Too close to nothing. Eli had laughed at him. Somebody's got to make the water clean, kid. He thought, too, of something his commanding officer had said once months back in the quiet, after a training run. There are things happening above your pay grade, Adeyemi. Things nobody puts on a briefing slide. Just trust that Earth has a plan. At the time, Jonah had marked it down as an officer trying to sound like he knew a secret. Now, watching 100 alien delegates vote his ship into a graveyard, he found himself hoping harder than he expected to that the man had meant it. He turned off the broadcast and called his uncle. It went to a recording. The frontier relays were slow. Eli always said. He left a message telling the old man to stay out of trouble and come home in one piece, and he did not think about it again for a long time. Deep beneath Geneva, Mirasalis was not sleeping. She stood in the pale glow of a single secure display, watching a marker that meant nothing to anyone who did not already know what it was. Anvil Station. Waking. 6 years of patient buried work coming up out of the dark all at once. They had built it past the last cold planet for exactly this. Wrapped it in materials that drank light and radar alike, powered it with systems that leaked almost no heat, funded it through a dozen boring line. Items spread so thin across the naval budget that no auditor would ever look at any single one of them long enough to add them up. It had cost more than she would ever say aloud. It had cost arguments in rooms she was not allowed to name, cost years of a government's nerve, cost the sleep of 24 people who had carried the weight of knowing. And in the central bay of that station in the black where no telescope could find it, something that Earth had never dared build in the light, was finally being asked to open its eyes. Chief Engineer Priya Anand stood on a gantry above the ship's long dark hull and watched the order come through on her tablet and felt her stomach tighten into a knot she had carried on and off for 6 years. Full activation. For 6 years the ship had been a possibility, a shape on a screen, a thing they hoped quietly in the private way of engineers who build weapons would never actually be needed. She had told herself that so many times it had almost become true. Bring the core online, she said to the technicians below her, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. Slow. Every system checked twice, before we run a single test. I want no surprises. Below her, along the great dark length of the hull, lights began to wake. Not all at once. One section at a time, the way a sleeping thing opens one eye, and then another, deciding whether the world is worth the trouble of standing. Deep in the ship's heart, the first reactor came up out of dormancy with a hum too low for anyone to hear directly, felt instead as a vibration in the gantry, in the deck plates and the small bones of everyone standing near. The first woke, and a long moment later, when the readouts held green, the technicians brought up the third. Priya watched 2 soft points of light climb on her board, where before, there had been only dark, and she thought about 100 delegates in a bright chamber, half a galaxy away, voting to make her species safe by making it harmless. She thought about the 3/4 of the fleet that would soon be cut apart under careful alien hands. She thought about how the entire settled galaxy now believed humanity was about to lay down and bare its throat. They had no idea what was breathing out here in the dark. She named the ship in her own head the way she always did, quietly like a prayer she wasn't sure she believed. Revenant. A thing that comes back. A thing you thought you had already buried. On the far side of that same dark out where the charts gave up and left only guesses, the first small killings had already begun. A convoy silenced. A scout that found nothing but scorched metal and questions. The whispers gathering into something that would not stay a whisper much longer. And between the bright chamber and the deep dark, on a young and frightened and stubborn little world, Mirasalis watched her single marker hold steady on the screen and let out a slow breath she felt like she had been holding for 8 years. The galaxy's oldest fear about humanity was about to come true. That was the thing none of them understood yet. Not Nirave in her cold chamber, not the delegates who had voted so comfortably, not even the frightened people in their apartments watching their ships condemned on the evening news. The fear was about to come true. and it was about to be the only reason any of them survived. 6 months went by under the long shadow of the charter, and week by week the human fleet grew smaller. Concord inspectors moved through the shipyards of Earth in careful teams, checking records, counting hulls, marking which vessels would be opened up and stripped first. The government cooperated fully in the open, exactly as the law demanded. Carriers that had taken a decade to build were pulled apart in a season. Cruisers that had never fired a shot in anger were fed into recyclers under the patient supervision of engineers from a dozen worlds. To anyone watching from the outside, humanity was being humbled, cut down to a safe and manageable size, one keel at a time. Mira Solis signed every decommission order herself. She had decided early that she would not delegate. It would not let some junior officer carry the weight of dismantling the thing she had spent her life building. So she read each report and she signed each order, and each one felt like watching a piece of her own history quietly taken out and buried. She kept her composure through all of it because she knew a thing the Concorde did not. The inspector assigned to the carrier that had been her first command was a small, quick creature of a species called the Sisk, pale-skinned and precise, with the kind of mind that liked numbers to add up. He found her on the observation deck as his team ran their scans below. Admiral Solis. His translated voice was flat and courteous. Your fleet records show a discrepancy. Fuel consumption across your naval budget, measured over 6 years, does not fully reconcile with your declared construction. Can you account for it? Solis did not let her face move at all. Training exercises, test programs, research vessels not covered under the Charter's definitions. We can provide full documentation if the Concorde requires it. The Sisk held her gaze a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he made a small note and moved on, apparently satisfied. She waited until he was well down the corridor before she let herself breathe. Anvil's funding was buried, carefully threaded through a dozen dull programs hidden in the kind of numbers no one reads twice. It had held so far, it would need to keep holding. It held long enough for the test. They took the Revenant out on a night with no moon in a stretch of empty space, far from any settled world. She slipped from Anvil's central bay like a shadow peeling itself off a wall, her engines burning a strange pale blue that threw off almost no heat a sensor could catch. In the command chair sat a young pilot named Nadia Cruz, and the moment the ship answered her hands, she understood that she had never truly flown anything before. Systems green across the board. She called back to the small crew scattered through the ship. Her voice caught just slightly on the wonder of it. She flies like she's reading my mind. Behind her, General Kane watched the readouts with something close to awe. He had seen the plans. He had walked the gantries. None of it had prepared him for the ship actually alive and moving, folding through the black, as if it belonged to the dark more than to the people who had made it. Full stealth, Kane said quietly. Let's see if she disappears the way Anand promised. Cruz's navigator, a steady young man named Theo Alvarez, brought the systems up. The outer hull seemed to fold in on itself, drinking the starlight, bending it in patterns designed to make the ship a hole in space rather than a thing within it. On the tracking boards back at Anvil, the Revenant's signature dropped away to almost nothing. A faint smudge that could as easily have been empty void. She's a ghost, Kane murmured. A damned ghost. For an hour they ran her through everything they had planned. Speed trials that would have torn an ordinary hull to pieces. Weapons calibration against dead asteroids that came apart clean and precise. Maneuvers that pushed the engines to a wall. The engineers had only ever theorized. Every test came back better than the last. Whether the Revenant was the most advanced ship in the galaxy, no one aboard could yet say. That she was the most advanced thing humanity had ever built, no one aboard could doubt. Back at Anvil, another reactor came up on Priya Anand's board while they flew. The third had woken during the test. Now quietly the fifth. She watched 3 points of light hold steady where months ago there had been only dark, and she did not smile exactly, but something in her chest eased. Tell the Admiral, Kane said as Cruz guided the ship home into her bay, that if the day ever comes when we need her, we are in very good hands. Half a galaxy away in the bright chamber of Halcyon, the day was already closer than any of them knew. Emiru of the Alans stood at the podium before a full session, a data screen glowing at his side, and for once his gentle voice carried an edge that made the chamber go quiet. 6 colonies along the frontier have reported unknown craft at the edge of their sensors in the last 2 months, he said. Ships that watch and wait and vanish before any response can reach them. 3 trading convoys are simply gone. This is no longer rumor, counselors. Something is testing our borders, and this Concorde has no answer ready. From the front row, Nirave frowned. The shared defense fleet exists for precisely this. We deploy it. We investigate. The shared defense fleet, Emaru said, and now the edge was unmistakable, was built from contributions every member pledged decades ago in a time none of us can quite remember being afraid. Half those pledges have quietly shrunk over the years as species grew comfortable with a peace they assumed would last forever. We do not have the strength we once had, Counselor, and at the very moment we may need it, we have taken the growing fleet of our most capable member and fed it into a recycler. A murmur moved through the rings of seats. Delegates shifted. Nirave's frown deepened, but she said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not sound in that moment like a woman defending a door she had bolted against the wrong side. We will send scouts to the frontier, she said at last, and we will ask Earth to provide humanitarian support to any colony that requests it. Nothing armed. Nothing more. She let her gaze move across the chamber, daring it to argue. The accord stands. Emaru looked at her for a long moment, his wide eyes unreadable. I hope, he said softly, that this is not a decision that comes back to find us. It found them within the month. The distress call came from a mining station on the frontier called Coldwater, home to something over 3,000 people from 3 different species and a handful of human contractors working the water systems under a trade agreement. It came through broken, cutting in and out of voice fighting static across too many relays. Under attack. Ships matching no registry. Defenses overwhelmed. Requesting immediate. And then nothing. The chamber at Halcyon fell into chaos as the channel went dead. Nirave stood frozen at her seat, staring at the flat silence where a voice had been a moment before. Emaru was already on his feet, calling for the shared defense fleet to move. No more scouts, no more careful looking from a distance. The fleet reached Coldwater far too late. They found the outer defenses gone, the docking rings torn open, debris drifting in a slow, wide field of broken metal and venting air. Search teams pulled survivors from sealed sections deep underground, people who spoke in shaking voices of ships that moved faster than anything they had ever seen. Weapons that went through shielding, as if it were not there at all. Of the attackers themselves, there was no sign. They had struck, taken what they wanted, and were gone before the fleet ever crossed the system's edge. Emaru received the full report alone in his quarters aboard Halcyon, and he read it slowly, the heaviness in his chest growing with every line. Over 400 confirmed dead, hundreds more missing, and near the bottom of the list of the missing 2 names that made something in him go cold and still. Human, contractors, water reclamation. One of them was a man named Eli Marchetti, who had, according to the dry notes of the report, been in the lower levels running a filtration line when the attack began and had not been seen since. Emaru sat with the report a long time. He thought of Ambassador Rourke, calm as still water, telling a chamber full of frightened elders that his people had not come to the stars to be told they could not defend their own. He thought of the fuel discrepancy an inspector had mentioned in passing, and been talked out of. He thought of Nirave, who was not cruel, who had never once in her long life been cruel, saying the accord stands in a voice that was trying very hard to sound certain. And he wondered, not for the first time and with a growing dread, exactly what mistake this Concord had made, and how much it was about to cost. The request for aid reached Earth within days, and it read like a cruelty even though no cruelty was meant. Send supply ships. Send medical teams. Send anything that could help the survivors of Coldwater rebuild. But send nothing armed. The charter was clear, and the charter still held. Ambassador Rourke forwarded it to Solace with a single line of his own beneath it. They want us to help fight the fire with our hands tied behind our backs. Solace read it in her office with the lights low, and then she read the report attached to it, the one with the casualty figures and the list of the missing. She read that list all the way to the bottom, the way she read every list because she had decided a long time ago that a person who signs the orders should at least be willing to know the names. She saw the human contractors. She saw one in particular, a water engineer, and beside it, a note that a relative in the fleet had already filed an inquiry. A young lieutenant. Adeyemi. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up a secure line and called Anvil Station. Doctor. Anand. Her voice was quiet and level. I need to know exactly how ready she is. Not for a test. For something real. There was a pause on the far end, the small silence of a person understanding that a line has just been crossed. Admiral Priya said carefully, if we take her out now, even just to walk a convoy to a colony, there's a real chance someone sees her. Concord sensor nets reach further than people think. The secret doesn't survive first contact. I know. Once she's out there, she's out there. We can't put her back in the dark. I know that too. Solace looked at the far wall of her office at nothing. But I am not going to explain to a family, Why we let their people fly unarmed into a war zone because we were afraid of getting caught. I would rather break a secret than break a promise. A breath. How long? Another pause. Then steady, give me 6 hours. She'll be ready. The convoy was 4 ships, 2 medical transports heavy with doctors and supplies, and 2 small support vessels carrying engineers to rebuild what the attack had torn apart. None of them carried anything heavier than the light point defense a ship uses to swat drifting debris. On the bridge of the lead transport, a doctor named Naomi Ekweme stood watching the stars slide by and felt a fear she had not expected tightening slowly under her ribs. "Captain," she kept her voice low, "do we have any escort at all?" The pilot was a weathered older man named Musa Diallo, and he did not lie to her because he could not. "Officially, no," he said. "The Concorde cleared this route with scouts 2 days ago. It's supposed to be safe." And unofficially, Diallo was quiet a moment watching his board. "Unofficially, I don't know any more than you do, Doctor. We fly. We hope. We trust that the people back home did everything they could." Neither of them knew that something faster and more dangerous than anything they could have imagined was already closing the distance behind them, running dark, matching their course a hole in space where no ship should be. The Scarn came the way they always came, without warning. 3 of them dropped out of some cloaked approach less than 2,000 kilometers off the convoy's flank, hulls dark and jagged and crawling with patterns that seemed to shift even as the ships held perfectly still. The transport's alarms shrieked, a warning that arrived far too late to matter. "Contacts," the sensor officer shouted. 3 closing fast, weapons hot. Diallo's hands flew across the controls, trying to angle away, trying to buy a handful of seconds he already knew he did not have. The Scarn were firing. Streaks of dark energy reaching across the black toward the convoy's thin shielding. Naomi gripped the edge of a console and braced her mind, flashing to the survivors of Coldwater and their stories of ships that moved like nightmares. Then something appeared between them and the dark. The Revenant dropped its stealth field less than 500 kilometers out, directly in the path of the incoming fire, its dark hull catching the starlight in strange, hard angles. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Then its weapons came alive, and the space around the convoy lit with a display of controlled violence that none of the humans aboard the transports had ever seen, and none of them would ever forget. Nadia Cruz's voice came over an open channel, steady and unhurried, as if she were reading a weather report. "This is Earth Vessel Revenant to convoy. Hold position. Let us handle this." Diallo stared at his screen as the newcomer twisted between incoming fire with an ease that looked almost lazy, its own weapons already tearing through the shielding of the nearest Scarn ship in seconds. "Where," he said slowly, "did that come from?" Nobody on the convoy had an answer. Almost nobody in the galaxy did. It lasted less than 4 minutes. The Revenant moved through the fight the way a thought moves through a quiet mind, flickering in and out of stealth, appearing at angles the Scarn could not predict, and firing before they could turn. One enemy ship came apart entirely, its hull splitting in a flat white flash. The other 2 broke and ran folding back into whatever cloak had brought them, unwilling to spend themselves on a fight they were plainly losing. On the transport, someone began to cry, and then several people. The sound of relief let out all at once. Naomi Ekweme realized she had been holding her breath and let it go in a rush, staring at the dark ship holding position beside them, its name and its makers, still a complete mystery to everyone aboard. "This is Revenant to convoy," Cruz said again. "You are clear to continue. We will walk you the rest of the way." "Thank you." Diallo's voice shook just slightly. "Whoever you are, thank you." There was a small silence on the line. "Just doing our job," Cruz said. "Stay on course." Word of the attack and of the ghost that had answered it reached Halcyon within hours, though what arrived was confused and full of holes. Survivors spoke of a dark, fast ship that came out of nowhere, killed 1 raider, drove off the rest, and then simply escorted them home, as if such things happened every day. No registry matched the description. No member claimed to have sent it. Nirave read the reports alone in her quarters deep into the station's night cycle, and she had her suspicion almost at once, though she said nothing yet to anyone. The speed of the thing, the way it vanished from every sensor, the way it had appeared at the precise moment and place to save that particular convoy. It matched no technology in the Concorde's archive, but the ships it had protected were Earth's. The doctors and engineers aboard were for the most part human. She called for a private meeting with Emaru the next morning. "You believe it was Earth," Emaru said once she had laid it out. His wide eyes studied her with a patience she was beginning to find unbearable. "I believe it is the only answer that fits." Nirave's voice was tight. "No other species in that region has reason to guard that convoy. No registered ship in the archive resembles what those people describe. If Earth built something outside the terms of the Charter Imaru, it is a violation. A grave one. Or, Amaru let the word sit. Earth built something to protect its people at the exact moment this Concord left them no other way to do it. He spread his soft hands. I do not defend the breaking of law, Nerave. But I understand it. I have read the same casualty list you have. I know whose names were on it. Understanding does not change the law. No, Amaru agreed quietly. But be careful how you carry this into the chamber. You will be asking 100 worlds to be angry at the ship that did what our own fleet arrived too late to do. They may not thank you for it. On Earth, Solace received word of the successful escort, with a relief she did not let reach her face. The convoy was safe. The doctors were already at work among the survivors, but the Revenant had been seen now, however dimly, and the story of it was already crawling through Concord channels like water, finding cracks. She met Rourke and Kane in a secure room beneath Geneva, the three of them turning the reports over between them. They don't have proof, Rourke said. Frightened survivors and a description. It can still be explained away, if we're careful. For how long? Kane's voice was flat. Nerave isn't a fool and neither is half that chamber. Sooner or later, somebody connects a dark, unregistered ship with impossible technology to the one species that just had its fleet gutted, and has every reason on the map to build something in secret. Solace let them argue for a while without speaking, watching the two of them the way she watched a board full of markers, waiting to see the shape the pieces made. The Skarn aren't finished, she said finally, and both men stopped. This was one attack on one convoy. A species bold enough to gut a border colony and then hit a defenseless supply run days later is not a species that stops. Whatever the Concord decides about us, I would rather have the Revenant ready to protect our people than hidden in the dark out of fear of getting caught. And if they demand answers, Rourke asked, then we give them the truth. She said it simply without heat. We built a ship in secret because we did not trust that a piece of paper would keep our people alive. I regret the lie. I will not regret the decision. Kane studied hair. You think it comes to that? A full reveal. I think the Skarn are not finished, Solace said again. And I think whatever comes next is going to be too big to hide behind. One convoy. Une colonne. One ghost. That's the small version of this. She looked at the far wall. Get Cruz and her crew ready for deployment on no notice. I don't want to be caught flat-footed twice. 3 weeks later, the Skarn stopped testing the fences and came through them. It was not a frontier station this time. It was Brightfall, a colony deep enough inside settled space that no one had thought to be afraid for it, home to nearly 70,000 people from 5 different species, a place of farms and schools and workshops that had never in its life heard a real alarm. The Skarn poured into the system in numbers the Concord had never seen from them, tearing through the colony's thin defense grid, laying siege to its orbital rings, while smaller craft dropped toward the surface to strike at cities that did not know how to be struck. The shared defense fleet scrambled to answer, still bleeding from its losses at Coldwater, and the numbers told a grim and simple story. Brightfall was under assault by a force far larger than the small tired fleet could hope to hold. In the chamber at Halcyon, the reports came in real time and the panic came with them. Nerave stood frozen before the great display, watching the casualty estimates climb by the minute. Amaru was already on his feet, calling for every available ship from every member, treaty limits and careful accords forgotten in the face of something too large to argue with. We need everything, Amaru said, his gentle voice raw. Every hull that can fly and fight. This is not a raid anymore, counselors. This is an invasion. Ambassador Rourke watched the session from a secure feed on Earth and felt the blood go cold in him. Brightfall was not far from human trade routes. If the Skarn pushed past it, if this truly was the front edge of a war, Earth itself might not be far behind. He opened a private line to Geneva, and Solace's face appeared calm, waiting. Mira, he said, they need everything they can get. Every ship. Anything. Solace's face did not change, but her eyes went hard and certain, the way they did when a decision she had carried for years finally set its foot on the floor. Then it's time, she said, for the Conquered to learn exactly what humanity built while they were busy taking apart the rest of our fleet. Far beyond the last cold planet, the order reached Anvil Station, and along the great dark length of the Revenant, and along the smaller hulls of the 5 support ships built in silence beside her, the reactors that had been waking one at a time for half a year now came up all at once. The first and the third and the fifth, and everyone still sleeping, all of them opening their eyes together in the deep dark until the station that had been built to give off no light at all burned quietly from within like a coal. Brightfall was burning when the Revenant arrived, and Commander Sereth Vun had already begun in the private country of his own mind to prepare himself to die. He led the shared defense fleet from the bridge of his flagship, and he was a good officer, careful and brave, and he had spent his whole life training for battle, without ever once believing he would see one like this. His sensor board was a field of red that his crew could not count fast enough to track. Every time they killed a Skarn ship, 2 more came through the system's edge to take its place. The enemy fought without pause and without mercy, spending hull after hull as if numbers alone were a strategy. And the terrible thing was that it was working. "We are losing ships faster than we can name them." His second reported voice pulled tight over a fear he was too disciplined to show. "Reinforcements requested. Nothing close enough to matter." Vun gripped the arms of his chair and watched the colony below him come apart. Evacuation shuttles clawed up out of the atmosphere in ragged lines, and the Skarn hunted them like the shuttles were the whole point, and there was so little he could do to stop it. "Hold the line as long as she'll hold," he said. "Protect the shuttles. That's all that's left to us now." He had made his peace with the arithmetic. He was still making it when a hole opened in space, 500 kilometers off his flank, and the Ghost stepped out of it. The Revenant dropped its stealth field into the middle of the worst of it, its dark hull suddenly blazing on every sensor in the system, and for one strange, suspended heartbeat, both fleets seemed to falter, the defenders and the Skarn alike, none of them certain what this new thing was, or whose side it had come to take. The heartbeat ended. The Revenant's weapons opened, and a Skarn cruiser that had been about to gut an evacuation transport simply came apart, its hull splitting in a flat white flare, and then the ship that had killed it was already somewhere else, killing something else, moving through the enemy formation the way a knife moves through cloth. What Vun breathed in all the cold dark is that, unregistered. His sensor officer's voice was thin with disbelief. "No match anywhere in the archive. But Commander, it's turning the battle." It was. Wherever the Ghost went, the Skarn died. It flickered in and out of stealth to break their targeting, appearing at angles no living pilot should have been able to hold, and it did not fight like a thing that was afraid. It fought like a thing that had already decided the outcome, and was only walking the enemy through the steps. And it was not alone. They came out of the dark behind it, 5 smaller hulls fanning wide across the battle, fast and precise and armed with weapons the Concorde had never catalogued, striking at the raiders that hunted the shuttles, throwing themselves between the enemy and the fleeing civilians below. Vun watched them spread across his ruined board, and he understood with a feeling he could not name that the single Ghost had never been the whole of it. The Ghost had been the first one to arrive. There had been more sleeping in the dark all along, waking one at a time, and now they were all awake at once. Not one Ghost. Etzil, aboard the Revenant, Nadia Cruz felt the ship answer her hands like it was reading the fight a half-second ahead of her, and she gave her orders in a voice that stayed level, because she had trained it to concentrate on the largest formation. "We break their center before they can pull it back together. Support wing. Keep those shuttles alive." The battle raged for nearly 2 hours longer and harder than anyone aboard had let themselves expect, and slowly, painfully, the shape of it changed. The Skarn faced at last with an enemy they could neither predict nor overpower began for the first time to hesitate. Their formations frayed. Their attack ran ragged. And then, in scattered and disorganized flight, they broke and ran for the edge of the system, and did not come back. In the chamber at Halcyon, the whole council had gone silent, watching footage relayed from the surviving ships of their own fleet, watching a single dark vessel and 5 smaller ones tear through an invasion that had been about to end a colony, saving shuttle after shuttle, buying with every pass the time that 70,000 people needed to live. "That is a human ship," Nirave said very quietly, almost to herself. "It has to be." Emaru stood beside her, his wide eyes fixed on the display, and he did not gloat because he was not that kind of person, but there was something in his stillness that was heavier than any word. "Whatever it is," he said, "it is doing what our fleet could not." Around the chamber, the other delegations had begun to speak all at once in a rising noise of shock and anger and reluctant awe. Some demanded to know at once whether Earth had broken the charter. Others pointed out just as loudly that whatever that ship was, it was at that very moment the only thing standing between Brightfall and total ruin. "We will address the charter when the crisis is past," Emaru said, and he raised his gentle voice until it carried over the noise and the chamber to its own surprise quieted for him. "Right now our only task is to support whatever force can still turn this. I move that this Concorde formally request the aid of Earth, in whatever measure Earth is able to give." Nirave turned to look at him, and he met her eyes without challenge and without apology. "And if this proves Earth deceived us from the very first day?" she asked. Then we will face that truth honestly, when the dying has stopped. He held her gaze. But I will not stand in this chamber and argue about a broken rule, while people are dying for want of the very strength that rule took away. The motion passed, though not without argument. The request went out across every Concord channel, Earth, send whatever you can. And on Earth, watching the words scroll across his feed, Ambassador Rourke felt a strange braid of relief and dread pull tight in his chest. The secret was over now in every way that mattered. There would be no more pretending. The Scarn did not leave cleanly. Thousands had died at Brightfall before the Revenant ever arrived in the first hours, when the colony had no answer at all, and no ship, however impossible, could give those hours back. That was the part crews would carry afterward, guiding the Revenant on a slow pass over the wreckage of the orbital rings while her crew searched for anyone still alive to be found. They had not won a clean thing. They had won a terrible thing a little less terribly than it would otherwise have gone. Admiral. She opened the line home, her voice worn down to the grain. It's over. Enemies in full retreat. We held Brightfall. In Geneva, Mira Solis let herself for one moment close her eyes. Good work, Captain, she said. Bring everyone home. But she knew, even as she said it, that the hardest part was only beginning. The Revenant had saved tens of thousands of lives. It had also proved past any possibility of denial in front of the entire watching galaxy that Earth had broken the charter in the most spectacular way a species could. 3 days later, Ambassador Rourke stood once more at the podium in the chamber of Halcyon, and the faces that studied him from the rising rings of seats studied him very differently than they had the last time. The story of Brightfall had crossed the galaxy in hours, carried by every network and every channel that existed. Everyone knew now about the ship called the Revenant. Everyone understood exactly what its existence meant. Nerave rose first, and her expression was closed, unreadable. Ambassador Rourke, this Concord would like an explanation. Earth was ordered to disarm under a charter your own government signed. Instead, we have learned that Earth secretly built one of the most advanced warships this galaxy has ever seen. In direct defiance of that law, Rourke did not flinch. He had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this, and he had decided he would answer it honestly with no excuses and no shelter. You are correct, Counselor. Earth built the Revenant in the dark. He let it stand plain and unsoftened. We built her after this Concord ordered us to cut apart 3/4 of our fleet. We built her because we did not believe that trust alone would keep our people alive in a galaxy we still barely understand. I will not apologize for the decision. I will only tell you that 3 days ago that ship kept tens of thousands of people breathing whom your own fleet arrived too late to save. The chamber was utterly still. He let the silence hold before he went on. Humanity did not build her to threaten anyone in this room. We built her because we remembered in our bones what it cost to be helpless in front of something that means you harm. We fought 2 wars against ourselves before we ever reached these stars. We nearly ended our own story. A species that has held its own throat in its own hands does not forget the weight of it. He looked slowly around the rings of watching faces. You feared what we might do with power. You never once asked what we would refuse to do with it. That ship could have arrived at Brightfall and demanded a price. It asked for nothing. It killed what it had to kill. It drove the rest into the dark, and it walked the survivors home. That is what we built. That is who we are. I regret the lie. I do not regret that our people were ready when it mattered most. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter, and it reached the far edge of the chamber all the same. Peace is not the absence of teeth, he said. It is the choice not to bite. We have made that choice every single day since we joined you. We made it at Brightfall in front of the whole galaxy. I would ask this Concord before it decides what to do with us to consider that the ship it wants to condemn is the only reason there is a Brightfall left to argue over. Emaru rose slowly from his seat, his wide eyes moving across the chamber before they came to rest at last on Rourke. This Concord must decide what to do with what it has learned, he said. But before that decision is made, I believe every member in this room owes Earth something more valuable than punishment. I believe we owe them our thanks. And Nerave, standing at the front of the chamber with the law she had defended her whole life crumbling quietly in her hands, did something she had never once done in all her years upon that floor. She said nothing at all. The debate stretched on for 2 weeks, and every day the story of Brightfall traveled a little further, and every day the ground shifted a little more beneath the beliefs Nerave had stood on for so long. She sat through session after session and listened to reports from grateful colonies, from families who were alive because a species she had voted to disarm had built a thing in the dark that no law allowed. She had spent her life arguing that humanity's strength was a danger to the peace. Now she watched that same strength, be the only reason the peace still had anyone left to keep it. The law exists for a reason, she said during one hard session, and heard how much less certain her own voice had become. If we let this violation stand unanswered, what do we teach every other member? That a treaty holds only until it becomes inconvenient. Across the floor, Emiru answered without heat. The law exists to protect the people of this galaxy, Narave, not the other way around. Humanity broke a rule. They broke it to keep alive the very people that rule had left defenseless. I would ask this Concord to weigh not only what was broken but why, and what the breaking revealed about a law that stripped an entire member and its neighbors bare in front of a real and rising enemy. The argument ran on in a dozen forms, but the shape of its ending had already been decided somewhere below the level of speeches in the quiet minds of 100 delegations reading the same frightening reports from their own frontiers. When the Concord finally voted, it did not punish Earth. It suspended the charter in its entirety and admitted in language it had never used before that the law had failed to imagine a real threat and had laid an unfair burden on a single member without offering anything in return. A new framework would be built. Every member Earth among them would be permitted a fleet matched to genuine need under reasonable oversight, rather than forced surrender. Nirave was the one who read the decision aloud, and when she reached the end of it she did not say the words she had said so many times in that chamber. She did not say that the accord stood. There was no accord left to stand. There was only a room full of old species learning something late that a young one had tried to tell them from the start. What came after surprised the Concord more than the battle had. Humanity, having proven it could not be forced, was under no obligation to be generous. It was generous anyway, and in ways the older species genuinely could not parse. Earth opened Anvil Station to Concord engineers, the very station it had hidden at ruinous cost, and let them study the stealth systems and the weapons that had turned Brightfall. It shared what it had learned. It threw its shipyards openly now into rebuilding the shared defense fleet that had so nearly failed them all. It asked for no reparation for the fleet it had been made to scrap. It let the whole matter of the deception simply fall as if it had never been owed anything for it at all. This is not how the strong behave, a delegate said in open session, and he did not mean it as praise so much as bewilderment. The strong take. They always have. What are they doing? No one had a good answer. It was Emiru in the end who came closest, and he only shrugged his soft shoulders and said that perhaps the humans had learned in their two terrible wars that taking was the thing that had nearly killed them, and had decided a long time ago never to build their house on it again. Nearly a year after Brightfall, Narave came to Earth. She had never set foot on it before. She stood on a balcony above the old city of Geneva as the local star went down behind the mountains, and beside her stood the human Admiral Mira Solis, who had been asked to host the visiting counselor herself, and had agreed without a word of complaint. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Narave said quietly, "You knew, on the day of the vote when your ambassador bowed his head and walked out so calmly. You already had her out there in the dark. We did. You let us disarm you, knowing you had not truly disarmed at all. We let you believe what you needed to believe," Solis said, "so that our people would be alive on the day you finally needed us. I won't pretend it was honest. It wasn't, but I have signed a great many orders in my life, counselor, and that is one of the few I have never lost sleep over." Nirave watched the last light leave the sky. "I was afraid of you," she said at last. "I want you to understand it was not hatred. I have read the histories of a dozen worlds that grew strong too quickly and turned that strength on everything around them, including themselves. I looked at your two wars and I saw the beginning of that same story. I still believe the fear was not entirely wrong." "Maybe it wasn't," Solis said. "Power with no limit has broken better species than mine, but power with no strength at all leaves you standing empty-handed in front of the thing that wants to eat you. We spent 8 years trying to show this Concord we could be trusted with both at once." She was quiet a moment. "I think finally we're starting to be believed." Nirave turned to look at her, this small, still gray-templed creature who had hidden a warship from the whole galaxy, and then having won, given it away. "Why did you not crush us?" she asked. "At Brightfall and after, you had the stronger ship. You had the truth on your side, and 100 worlds in your debt. You could have named any price and we would have paid it. Why hold your hand?" Solis looked out over the darkening city at the ordinary lights coming on in ordinary windows, at all the small, breathing lives that had never known how close the dark had come. "Because we already know what it costs to bite," she said. "We spent 100 years learning it on ourselves. We buried more of our own than the Scarn ever took from you. When you have held the knife to your own throat and only just managed to set it down, you stop mistaking the ability to hurt for a reason to—" She turned to the counselor, and there was no triumph in her face, only something older and quieter. You feared what we might do with power. We spent our whole young history learning what to refuse. That was the part you never saw. That was the part we were trying to show you all along. Nirave was silent for a long time. Emaru told me, once she said finally that understanding does not change the law. She watched a single early star find its way through the fading light. I think perhaps it should. I think perhaps the law itself must learn its people before it decides how to bind them. Far above the two of them, past the reach of any telescope on the ground, the Revenant held a slow orbit in the dark. It was not hidden anymore. There was no reason to hide it, and no way and no wish. It simply held its station over the world that had built it dark and patient and awake the way a thing keeps watch when it has finally been allowed to be seen. And far out beyond the last edge of every chart, past the frontier and the wreck of Coldwater and the healing scar of Brightfall in the deep unmapped dark where the Scarn had gone to lick their wounds and remember something old and hungry, watched the small bright world at the galaxy's young edge and wondered whether it had seen everything that world could do, or whether it had only seen the very beginning.